Welcome to today's CG Talk, Race in America, Pursuit of Happiness, Spoils of War with Bo Kemp, whom I'll introduce in a moment. I'm Phil Terry. Those of you who know me know that before I got involved in the early days of the web, I was a community organizer in New York City. In fact, when I moved to New York in 1989, after having been a leader in the anti-apartheid movement in the US and the UK, and after having spent some time in Nigeria with political activists, musicians, and artists, I had a rude awakening. On the streets of Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, Harlem, and the South Bronx, I discovered what many white people are discovering today, that my hard-scrabble childhood and the success I had despite it was more about white privilege than I had ever realized. My liberal politics and activism did not make me better than any other white person, and importantly, did not make me less racist. These were hard lessons to learn then and to keep learning today. When I talk to white internet leaders today, they are frantic to know what to do, and they are somewhat traumatized by the realization that they too know nothing about race and that they too have benefited from it, whatever politics they might have or childhood situation. Yesterday, I was speaking to a liberal white woman leader, and we were talking about Amy Cooper and what happened in Central Park a few weeks ago. I told her that all white people, we are all some version of Amy Cooper. Amy Cooper's response may have been extreme, but it demonstrates white privilege. Privilege that I and many of you on the call may not have always felt growing up, but has undoubtedly played an important role at various points in our lives. In fact, in the midst of confrontation and fear, do we as white folks revert to a kind of white supremacy ideology like Amy Cooper did as a means of protection? Bo Kemp would say the answer is yes, and so would I. And so the next question is, why are white people fearful? That's part of what Bo is going to help us understand, how fear has been created and manipulated in the history of racism in America. Let me tell you a little bit about Bo. Today, he's senior director at Faegre Drinker, where he partners with a national network of advisors, advocates, government, and business leaders to help drive growth, tackle major initiatives, and boost efficiency in cities around the country. And he's done that for the last 15 years. In fact, back in 2006, Bo became the chief operating officer of Newark, New Jersey, number 2 to then mayor, now Senator Cory Booker. Bo and I met at Harvard Business School in the 90s. Many of our classmates, in fact, are with us today. Shout out to all of you and to Section E, of which Bo was a part, and many Section E are here to show some support. And Bo and I have remained friends, and through the years, he's not only been a good friend, but a good teacher, helping me understand ever more about the history of race in America. What Bo has to teach is very important, and it can be hard to hear. So open your ears, listen. And while Bo is speaking, feel free to put questions in the chat and put them to everyone so we can all see them. And when we get to Q&A, Bo will try to answer all of your questions. Bo, you and your sister have spent much of the last decade piecing together your family's history. You've discovered how much it's interwoven with the history of all the peoples in America, from Native Americans to, of course, African Americans to white settlers and slave owners, and how it tells the story of race and America in a powerful and a hard way. There are many people here today ready, Bo, I hope, to listen to you. Thank you, my friend, for coming and for helping us better understand where we come from so we can better be positioned to move forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I am honored to be here, Phil, and it's actually humbling to see so many people participating and so many folks from our college days or graduate school days and from my section that are here. So I'm really excited to share the work that I've been engaged in for a while. If we can go ahead and share my presentation, I think we've coordinated with some of the technical difficulties, and we're gonna have Brittany share the presentation. And so I'll have to let you know when to move to the next slide. But while we're doing that, I won't go into a ton more about my background. Phil did a great job with that, but I do want to go to the next page, which talks a little bit about how I got here. This is a work in progress, and where it came from was in 2012. I started this journey to kind of figure out kind of who I am and you know how I got here, so to speak. And it really started in 1985. I had a conversation with my father, who's passed away now. And in that conversation, my dad mentioned something kind of not quite casually, but not, in a way that kind of raised the alarms and the questions that I've been dealing with, which was, hey, my father, his father, my grandfather's actual last name is not Kemp. It's actually Seawright. Kemp was his stepfather, and he took that name as a child. But there was a gentleman by the name of Seawright who actually was his biological father. Well, I didn't have any further conversation with my dad about that. He passed away. I never had a conversation with anybody else in my family about it. But in 2012, I get this phone call from my sister, and my sister says to me, hey, I've been doing all this genealogy research and doing DNA work, and I have found out that actually our last name, and before she could finish it, I told her Seawright. My dad had a conversation with her completely separate from me. She and I had never had this conversation together. And I had kind of heard through urban legend that our name was different. She had actually gone through and figured out exactly who Seawright was and how we were related. And that really sparked this whole interest that I had in trying to figure out, well, who I am and how are we connected. She had already had a head start on me, and then I dove in, and then we began sharing notes over the course of the last 10 years plus and figuring out our genealogy, and we've learned a lot. I really then kind of figured out that I wanted to tell this story to my children, kind of as a legacy for them. And between me and my wife, our families essentially touch most of the major groups in the United States in its formation, from different tribes of the Choctaw tribe in the Mississippi Valley Delta, African slaves, to European settlers who've come here, and a kind of an integration of all of that, including even Taino Indians in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And what I realized in this process is there's a lot of patterns to what is happening in my family that reflect a lot of the patterns of what's happened in the United States. And so this is my attempt to kind of tell that story, to put some personal touches on it, to speak to individual people, to use as much as I can documentation, historical documentation, to kind of validate a lot of what I've come up with. And this is a work in progress. I hope to turn this into something more formal, but you are the first people to kind of get the first glimpse of the work in progress. Next slide. So I have 4 things that I want to share with you all today and cover. The first is the uniquely American complexity of race. The second is the bootstrap mythology and American wealth building. The third is America's race problem summed up in one word. And then lastly, the untapped American productivity stifled by racism. Next slide. So in the uniquely American complexity of race, next slide, please. I'm starting here with my 3rd great grandmother on my paternal grandmother's side. So the grandmother of my father and her grandparents, her lineage. And this is a woman whose name is Martha Brady. Martha is related to me as she is the mother to William M.A. Moore, who is my 2nd great grandfather, who was the father of James Bunn Moore, my great grandfather, who is the dad of my grandmother on my father's side, Rosalie Rivas, making me a direct descendant of her. Interesting enough, records indicate that she had 3 children, Eliza, Marion, Franklin, and William, both from non-consensual and consensual relationships, and that's a pattern that you'll see repeated throughout history. And her records indicate that her racial classification shifted at many times throughout history. She is the daughter of Jesse Brady, who is listed as a person of color, and Louisa Scott, who is listed as white. She's their oldest daughter. She was born free in 1845 in Greene County, Tennessee, to her parents. Next slide. I bring her up and I bring her relationships up because there's some core important elements of understanding the complexity of race in America. One of them is, particularly as a woman, the hardships and how race, marriage, and rape play an integral part in the day-to-day life of Black women throughout this period. So she had, as we can identify, 5 relationships with men of some form or another, some consensual, some non-consensual. At the age of 14, Martha was married to Tom, who at the time was 30, in 1859. The documentation of their marriage states that they were both people of color. You're going to hear this term people of color, which we use today in a vernacular that means something similar to what it meant back then, except back then people of color was indication that somewhere along the line, the black person had a relationship with someone who was white. And so they're of mixed race, in effect. Martha, at the age of 14 and 15, lived with the Brady family and was listed as a mulatto in the 1860 census. Most Black Americans are actually not listed in the 1860 census because the first time that Black Americans were consistently listed in the census was the 1870 census, which comes after, obviously, the Civil War. But because she was born free, which is an interesting aspect in and of itself, and in Tennessee, which was a state that was kind of in between, she was listed on the census. By the age of 17, her and Tom actually have a daughter, Eliza, born in 1864. And on the basis of the information we have of her marriage and so forth, we believe that that was a consensual relationship. DNA does tie me to Eliza Craig. Tom appears to have died shortly after the Civil War, sometime around 1866. Well, as we move forward, she has another relationship, and it is unclear who the father is in this instance, but in 1862, Marion Franklin Moore is born in the middle of the Civil War, right really at the tail end of the Civil War. In the 1860 census, Marion is not reflected living with Martha, but in the 1870 census, he is. My DNA connects me to Marion as well, and it connects Marion as being related to the Brady family. As you move forward, in the middle of the Civil War, there's another gentleman by the name of Martin Gabby. Sometimes it's spelled with an I, a Y, sometimes spelled with an I, who travels from different parts of Tennessee and somehow interacts with Martha. It's unclear how their interaction came about, but what is clear is that I have a direct DNA relationship, as does my sister and my uncle, to Martin Gabby and the Gabby family. Martin Gabby and Martha produced William M.A. Moore, born in 1865, who is the second great grandfather that I mentioned early on. We believe that this was a non-consensual relationship and resulted in rape. This would have been her third child that she had at the age of 19. Now, one of the things that should be noted is that in the 1860 census, she's listed as mulatto, but by the time we get to the 1870 census, Martha is now living with a gentleman by the name of William Hall. She has all 3 of her children with her, Eliza, Marion Franklin, and William. All children, excluding Martha, are all listed as white, as William Hall is listed as white. I don't have conclusive evidence that Martha and William were in fact married, but family lore speaks to the fact that a William Hall is somehow related to this Moore family. I'll take a moment and pause on this and just to say, I received a phone call in 2019 from a gentleman named Jay Moore, who currently lives in Tennessee, who saw all of the work that I had done on ancestry.com and wanted to get some additional information because his third great grandfather is William Moore, Marion Franklin Moore, excuse me. And in that process, he's one of the people who helped me identify William Moore as having a relationship to the Moore family, and the Moore family is related to the Bradys, but we haven't been able to find any of the documentation that ties them together. Well, by 1880 rather, she's no longer in this relationship with William Hall. She's now married to Thomas Moore. Thomas Moore is listed as mulatto, and Thomas Moore, along with Martha, are now living with both Elizabeth as well as William M.A. Moore. And there's a whole series of other children that are there, were part of Tom's original marriage, and they're all listed as mulatto. And a couple of things here I want to note, that throughout the course of her relationships, she's had a number of relationships with men who were both consensual and non-consensual, and children with all of them, and has had to move forward with all of those children. And her ability to also pass as white at times made a big difference in where she was able to live and keeping all of her children together. And this whole issue about the role that race plays in your ability to prevent non-consensual relationships or rape, your ability to be married, your ability to keep your family intact, your ability to either pass or not pass as white is something that is deeper than we can get into in the time that we have, but an important element. Next slide.
Yeah.
One of the things here that I wanted to highlight is this concept of what's called the one drop rule. And it's been white America's attempt to classify race. So what you'll see on your left-hand side of the screen is this diagram that basically shows if a white person and a black person have a child, that child is considered mulatto. If a white person and a mulatto person have a child, that child is characterized as quadroon. And as you go so on and so on, it shows a pattern where if the offspring only marries someone white, eventually that person will be characterized as white. But each of the boxes that are colored, whether they be black, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, or musty, are all forms of people of color or mulatto. And the census, which you see at the top right-hand corner, is the documentation to try to make the distinction between those people who are black and only African blood, those people who are white and only white blood, and those people who are mixed in any form or not. Now, the funny thing is I've always grown up and I've told my children who come in every color, black people come in every color, right? From Mariah Carey to Wesley Snipes. And I took the picture that you see on the bottom right-hand corner because for most black Americans, they see that picture and they instantly recognize that that is a black family. The only person in that picture who might not be black is the father. But for a lot of white people, they look at that picture and they're very unclear that that's a black family. And I use that because this idea of classifying race has been a really important concept, but it's also really a quixotic one in the sense that for a lot of people, it's not evident upon looking at someone what their race is. Next slide.
Hey, Bill, there's a comment in the chat. I don't know if you see that, if you want to respond to that now or later.
I didn't see the comment only because of my computer, but if you could share the comment with me, that'll be good.
So one of our attendees, a white woman who's married to an African-American man, said that the first time that her husband's dad met their daughter, Olivia, he said, she's not going to pass. And she had to ask her husband later what that meant and, you know, learning what that experience is. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't have the time to go into all the elements of passing here and what the implications are, but I try to touch on a lot of the issues in this. And this is actually not a bad segue to this comment here, which is, you know, there's been this effort to reassure white America that white is dominant. You know, that first graph kind of shows you how you kind of get to white if you start at black. This upper left-hand corner is literally something that was produced by a scientific entity that basically tried to give confidence to white folks that if you happen to, by happenstance, have someone in your lineage who was mulatto, that as long as they continued to marry people who are white and have offspring with them, that eventually what you'll have is a white baby. Because the fear was that at any given moment, right, if I have any black blood, you might pop out a baby who can't pass, right? You may pop out a baby who's a different color. And frankly, genetics prove that to be the case. The picture that you see here on the bottom right-hand side is a picture of my wife's grandmother. She's Marguerite, all the way to the farthest to the right side. But those are all her biological sisters from the same mother and father. And again, it goes back to this idea, black people come out in every color, you know, and regardless of what your parents look like, what you may come out can vary dramatically. I'm darker than both my mother and my father, for example. So next slide. So racial purity has been really central to America, so important that it's been legislatively protected. Now, going back to Jesse Brady, who is the father of Martha Brady, who I started with, my third great grandmother, turns out that the state of Tennessee actually filed a miscegenation case against him and Louisa Scott, who I mentioned before. Jesse Brady rather, was person of color. Louisa Scott, his wife, was white. They filed in 1948 a miscegenation case against him and lost.
1848, right?
1848. Excuse me, 1848. Thank you. And what you see here is a snippet from the actual case. What's interesting is the documentation of the case itself is actually available online. and you can read it. And I've only taken a snippet here. What's also interesting that happened is they lost the case, and the penalty back then was that each person who lost the case was required to pay $500 to the state of Tennessee for an unlawful marriage between a black person or a person of color and a white person. This, what you actually see here, is Jesse Brady fought Tennessee and said, well, the way that the statute reads, only the white person is supposed to pay that fine, not the person of color. So if both me and my wife are being fined, which is what happened, then you basically are saying that we both are of color, or we're both white, and therefore we did not, unlawfully wed. If in fact you are correct and we are unlawfully wed, only Louisa should have to pay the fine, not me. He actually won that case in court. And that's what this document shows you on the left-hand side. But as a result of losing the case, on the right-hand side, what you see is that he lost his children, because any children that are born from an unlawful marriage in that time were required to be orphans of the state. And so Martha Brady, my third great grandmother, and all her brothers and sisters were identified as orphans of color and were taken from their family. Next slide. This idea of race is so perverse that it plays out in sex and family relationships and wealth. This is a snippet from a book called Against the Odds, Free Blacks and Slave Societies, and it's really talking about New Orleans. My wife's family is partly from New Orleans, partly from Puerto Rico, and when you go through the history, we can identify her family going back to the 1700s, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the interesting things that you'll see is that back in the 1700s in New Orleans, it was relatively typical that wealthy white plantation owners took a second wife and a second family. And it was open. So everybody knew that I had my white family and I had my black family. But there were some benefits if you were the black woman who was the second wife of that wealthy plantation owner. And it turned out, in terms of housing and children, often bestowing rights such as the ability to own property and to actually pass on wills, had a demonstrable impact on the creation of black wealth. One of the things you'll see, and I can't go into here, is if you were to look at the wealth of black people in New Orleans in its early stages, it is predominantly held by black women, not by black men. And that's a function of this concept of taking these second wives and the rights that were happening for free women of color, or Morena Libre. Next slide. So race continues to be a central part of the formation of our country. We've tried to codify race as an identifier despite our inconsistency in its application. Rights to do things, rights from things, as well as liberties broadly are tied directly to the classification of race, but they're often altered by the regional mores and values, as in the case of New Orleans. Our attempt to legislate racial classification was designed to keep the white race pure from fear of miscegenation. And the idea that we would use science as a mechanism to reassure that white genes were dominant were also a response to the fear of miscegenation. Next slide.
Hey, Bo, I just want to add that, one of our attendees on the call today is the son of an Auschwitz survivor. They were, his mother was and father were both German Jews that the Germans attempted to kill. And he's an educator, an activist, and actor. And what he's taught me a lot, and I think we talked about this a little bit, is that all of the Nuremberg laws that the Nazis put into place were directly inspired by the laws in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's just remarkable that, Hitler literally said, this is, I'm taking this from the Americans. And the laws that were actually still on the books, by the way, and very much still on the books until recently in some cases. So
no, that's an excellent point. Yeah. And you've made this point to me directly, apartheid in a very similar way.
The South African apartheid regime, totally directly from the United States. The Bantustans were Indian reservations. They got that idea from us. Yeah.
So the next segment of this is called the bootstrap mythology and American wealth building. Next slide. And when you think about a myth, there's always some element of truth in the myth, but there's always some element of exaggeration. the reason I'm focusing on this is that there is a direct generational tie and benefit to those people who are coming from these first families, so to speak. This is obvious, I think, to people, but there are a couple of elements here that may not be as obvious, which is that as the United States defeated native tribes and acquired lands, the way to keep those lands was to populate them. And so there was a major effort to actually recruit Europeans to come and settle these lands, because that was the way to actually keep the lands in the hands of the settlers as opposed to the lands of the native tribes. As a result of that, there was a big fueling of the transatlantic slave trade to keep those lands productive, because there weren't enough European settlers that were coming to the Americas at that time in order to make those lands productive. What you see on your lower right-hand slide here is the colonial roads. I mentioned this and I use these roads because one of the ways that I had to go about trying to identify a lot of not only my family, but the slave owners of my family, and I've tracked them both, was to actually follow the movements of people on the basis of changes in agriculture and transportation routes. Interestingly enough, if you look at the dark blue or purple line, depending on your color sign, that's actually 95. And each of these lines, which were
Interstate
colonial
95,
roads,
right? Yeah.
Interstate 95, each of them as colonial roads are now interstate highways. And as they progressed, this is how you'll see the migration of both Europeans, but also slaves who mostly came in through the mid-Atlantic, translate down to the south and translate to the west. And these, next slide, and these people actually formed what were identified as the first families. The first families are those families that are documented in the 1790 census, which was the first census of the United States. So I mentioned the importance of being able to capture that land and make it productive. And that's really one of the major drivers of the transatlantic slave trade. I thought this slide was important because I think a lot of people don't have a perspective of the slave trade. In my mind, it's the largest redistribution of wealth in history. And as you can see, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, there's a total of 10 million people. And what that reflects is, as you go every 25 years or so, starting in 1501 on to 1875, and you look across the top where it shows you those slaves that were brought to Europe, mainland North America, Caribbean, Spanish America, Brazil, Africa, and others. This is the at least most comprehensive documentation of those people who actually lived through the Middle Passage, meaning they were captured in Africa and they were successfully kept alive and brought to any one of these locations that you see here. It does not account for those people who were died in the process of being captured, and it doesn't account for those people who were died in the Middle Passage itself. But 10 million people were documented to have actually survived that journey, and they were distributed in the way that I show here at the bottom. So if you look at the three red circles, you'll see 10 million people total. What you'll see if you look at the second, the red circle under Caribbean, is that 500,000 of those people, or 500 million of those, 5 million, excuse me, of those people were brought to the Caribbean. The Caribbean was really the staging spot. So although Columbus never set foot in the United States, he did set foot in Cuba, in Guanabacoa, Cuba, and he did set foot in Puerto Rico. And all of the islands, including Jamaica and Haiti, and that entire space is actually where most slaves were brought first before they actually were transitioned to the other parts of America. But it's 5 million people, almost 50% of the total people that were captured. The other thing I think is just interesting to note is that almost 3.5 million of those slaves were brought to Brazil. Brazil is the largest Black nation outside of Nigeria in the world. And a lot of people don't realize or think about Brazil in that context unless you've ever been. But it also happens to be a note that as slavery was being eradicated in the United States, lastly in Texas, which is why we have the Juneteenth Day, a lot of those people, as they were moving southern and west in order to maintain their slave tradition, moved to Brazil because Brazil didn't ban slavery for many years after to come. Yeah. And actually, I've identified some of the ancestors of my slaveholders who did that, in fact, after the Civil War, as opposed to stop owning slaves, they moved to Brazil so they continue to own slaves.
Hey, Bo, quick question on this slide from Lisa Leshny, who I think might be a section mate of yours, right?
She is.
She's asking about the Africa column. Are those Africans taking slaves from other parts of Africa and bringing them to Africa, to other parts of Africa, or what is that?
Yeah, that is my understanding. And what you'll see is that there are 4 groups, I mean, kind of broadly, East, South, West, and North Africans. But what you'll see in many instances is that Africans who were captured East were then traveled around, South Africa and brought to the West, and vice versa. A lot of slaves in North Africa brought from sub-Saharan Africa. But that is my understanding of what that represents.
Yeah, yeah.
So the two lines that you have here, the blue square and the green square. So the point about the blue square I wanted to make is that this will show you that from 1700 to essentially the Revolutionary War, that's when the majority of African slaves were brought directly to the American colonies. You'll see the numbers are very small prior to that. You'll see the numbers dwindle off significantly after that. 1806 is when transatlantic slavery to the United States is actually outlawed. But when it's outlawed, what you'll see is there's a shift. It's not that those slaves are not coming anymore to the United States. It's just that they're being counted as being brought directly to the Caribbean, and then they're being transported from the Caribbean to the United States. And that's the green circle that you'll see there. I think one of the things that surprises people is that even with these numbers, the numbers of slaves that were brought to the United States may not be quite as large as you would have thought. It's a huge number by any stretch, but it's not exactly the numbers that you may have thought. And that speaks to a whole series of other issues that we won't get into. I think the one takeaway I want you to get from this are really 1A and 1B, the mass redistribution of wealth in the name of people. There's a direct correlation between GDP and people in most economies.
Yes.
And this time, this is absolutely a redistribution of wealth that takes place. The second thing I'd like you to think about is for most Black Americans, they can trace their family heritage in this country back to pre-Revolutionary War. Most Black Americans can trace their lineage in the United States further back than the vast majority of white Americans can. And that's just something that doesn't ever seem to ring true in the conversations that we have about, who's really an American and who's not. Next slide. This slide, I'm not going to talk much about, but what is important is it speaks to that this was truly an economic endeavor, right? So the idea of redistribution of wealth really was that, and it was fueled by this idea of the triangular trade, right? Slaves coming to Americas, those slaves actually building the goods that will actually go back to Europe, and additional trading that was going from Europe to Africa. There's a longer history around that trade. In fact, one of the things that I believe is that the fall of Constantinople is actually part of the reason that the slave trade kicked off, because it broke the tie between the East and West patterns of trading of goods and products. And once that broke down, traders started to look for other things to trade that didn't require them to go through Constantinople. That's a different conversation in a different book, but I think it's relevant because it speaks to why those slaves were actually transported to different parts of the New World. Next slide. I want to really get into this idea of this myth, because there's this thought process that Europeans came here and they used all their hard work and they did this all on their own in order to figure out how to make it work. Well, what this document here shows is that in 1763, in order for them to maintain the land that they had just successfully beat back the Indians for, they were actually encouraging Protestants from Ireland to come to Charlestown, South Carolina, and giving them land as a result of coming. The 3 people that you see in those red circles, Andrew C. Wright, James C. Wright, and Elizabeth C. Wright, are the descendants of the slave owners of my 3rd great grandfather, C. Wright, that was the father of my grandfather, right? And so this is one of the things that was used as a way to secure land, head rights. Next slide, please. The other thing that was used were land grants to war veterans. So every time there was a war in the United States, those people who participated in the war were often granted land as a function of their role in fighting the war. So what this document shows you here is John Alexander Brent is actually the slave owner of the grandfather on my mother's side, Brent in Mississippi, who we'll mention later. And as a result of his participation in the War of 1812, he received land in Pike County, Mississippi, which is where my grandparents are from. Next slide. So what you see here is that when I look across at the slave owners of my ancestors, all of them came here from a variety of different places, but they share a couple of things about them. They typically either were already soldiers when they got here, especially the people who came in the earliest stages, or they became soldiers when they were here, and that was one of the ways that they acquired their land. Once they got to the United States, regardless of whatever they did for a living prior, they went into the business of agriculture, which was the internet of the day, and the way for them to generate wealth. And as a factor of being in that space, they became slave owners, right? And what you'll also see, and I don't have time to go through in detail, is that where they started and where that family ended up really followed the lines that I showed you of those colonial roads. And as their children wanted to reach out on their own and create their own wealth, they continued to travel down south and travel west, and they would take some of the slaves with them. So they would break up families in order for their sons and daughters to either be dowry in a marriage or to help their son start a new farm as they moved from Virginia to North Carolina to South Carolina to Tennessee to Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, etc. You can also see across here, they come from a variety of spaces. So Martin Gabby, who is the one who had non-consensual rape of my third great grandmother, he's from Switzerland, right? Came here in Berks County, Pennsylvania, was a Revolutionary War vet, ended up dying in Washington County, Tennessee. He received his land in Tennessee as a function of his work in the Revolutionary War. He is the ancestor of Jesse Brady. William C. Wright came here in 1747. He fought the Indian tribes in South Carolina and was awarded a plantation in Berkeley, South Carolina. My ancestor is Enoch C. Wright. I don't have a DNA connection to the C. Wright family. He owned my family. William Moberly was a captain, came here in 1690, actually in Maryland. He is the direct descendant of Jefferson Brent, who is the Brent part of the ownership where I showed you of the John Alexander Brent, who got the land from War of 1812. That's my third great grandfather, my grandmother's great grandfather. Same with Captain Smith, who is came here from England, a very similar story. He was actually killed by Indians. The last one I'll talk about, which is the seventh great grandfather of my wife, whose family came here. This gentleman came from France. He was the only one who was not a soldier. He came from a wealthy family. He came to Mobile, Alabama in 1719. And Claude Joseph Andre Dubreuil Villiers is actually one of the most successful and richest people in all of New Orleans history. He built most of New Orleans. In fact, he owned all of the mines and kilns that were necessary to do the bricks, as well as the sugar plantations and cotton plantations there. Her grandmother, Marguerite Lombard, was the woman I showed you in that picture. And what's interesting there is that family, the Lombard family, is a function of all of the work he did. He brought all these slaves in. And in fact, the reason that there's a DNA connection is because of a free woman, a slave, a woman named Nanette, who became free. Her offspring are the ones that became part of the Lombard family. And that's the connection on my wife's side. Next slide, please. What I want to try to show you is why this whole issue of wealth, the timing of when people came, why it potentially matters, right? So unfortunately, this is from ancestry.com, so it's a little backwards, but start from right to left. So like you're reading Hebrew or Arabic, right? So they came from England to Maryland, the Moberly family, and then the Moberly family actually built their riches with William Moberly, who is on the very top of the screen, is the son of John Moberly and Elizabeth Venns. Their son, in order to build his wealth, moved from Maryland to Virginia as the land became populated and also the land became depleted. John Moberly actually has a daughter, Ann Nancy Moberly, who's kind of the third down, and she marries Richard Neely, and they move from Virginia
Go
to
to the
South
left.
Carolina. There you are, right up there. Go up. There you go. Perfect. Right? And then they have a daughter, Nancy Ann Neely, and I have DNA connections to these folks, who marries John Brent. So one of the things that was tricky as I went through this process is I was looking for people on the Brent side that I'm related to, and it became clear that actually it was the wife who actually essentially got through wills the slaves, and they used the name Brent because that was the husband's name, but I'm actually a Neely and a Moberly, not a Brent. But that's just how it works. But a couple of things you see here, my ancestors were essentially passed down from generation to generation to generation in order to establish the wealth as they moved from location to location to location in order for new families to be formed. And they moved from this kind of mid-Atlantic area down to the south as those lands opened up and became available. Next slide. So the transfer of that wealth is documented actually, but not everybody gets to see it directly. What you see here is actually a portion of the will from Elizabeth Miller Creighton's estate, who was on my grandmother's side, my father's grandmother's side. And what you see listed in that red circle there is my family. So Caesar, Millie, and Harriet are my direct descendants. Turns out Millie's actually, and documented, came directly from Africa to North Carolina, which is where they were. Caesar came from Virginia to North Carolina. Harriet was born there. But funny enough, Harriet is actually not actually Caesar's daughter. He's Millie's daughter, but not Caesar's daughter. Harriet actually, Millie was raped, and Harriet is the offspring of one of her slave owners. But you can see directly what the value was of their slaves, right? So you can see $400, $500, $555, based on whether you're male, female, and what your age is. And I bring that because I want to make it very tangible of this concept of the generational wealth that gets passed down and the wealth that's being created through the transatlantic slave trade and the redistribution of people. Next slide. So there's a pattern that you'll see. Agriculture, as I said, is kind of the driver. Those days they were called planters, which is where the word plantation comes from. Although they were industrious people, they accumulated their land largely through head rights and land grants. And so those were government-sponsored incentives in order to attract Europeans to come and own this land. And those who were the most industrious became the largest landowners and the largest slave owners. And they traveled from the mid-Atlantic states down south and down west as those roads were built and as lands were acquired from native populations. And they passed that generational wealth down essentially on the back of cheap slave labor, because you can't manage hundreds and hundreds of acres of plantation without actual labor. And they couldn't have enough children their own in order to do it, so they had to bring that labor in. We also see that the lives of the slaves and the owners are inextricably linked, right? In many cases, you know, not only are they linked by DNA, but they're linked by movement. And so part of what I had to do in order to trace my family was to trace the entire population of the slave owners in order to be able to get closer to identifying my family. And you'll also see that many of these families essentially were raping their workers as part of a process of you know, having more children that in fact would be able to work their land. Next slide. There were chances to develop Black wealth, but many of these patterns on the Black side were disrupted. And I'm using a couple of examples here of my direct family to talk through some of those issues. So the case of my second great grandfather, John Henry Alexander. John Henry Alexander was actually born John Stogner. Stogner was the slave owner's name, but he hated the slave owner so much that when the Union Army came through his town and freed the slaves, he changed his name and chose the name Alexander. We don't know why, but he did. And he joined the Union, and we have documentation. He fought in the Civil War against the Confederacy as well. He actually, fascinating guy, he couldn't have a will, but he did have life insurance. There's a period in history where there was scams for Black Americans where people were selling them life insurance, never with the intention to actually provide that. But in his instance, his brother actually fought and got the insurance that was due to him after his death. But in most cases, it was illegal, not only to have life insurance, to own property or to have a will. The second person that you'll see here is Jefferson Brent, who's the patriarch of my mother's grandmother's side. He actually, and that's related to the Brent family and the Moberlys and the Neelys that I mentioned earlier. He actually owned land. I still have not been able to figure out why and how, but he was granted 40 acres in the mid 1860s. And what's interesting though is he did not live on that land, nor did he farm it. He was counted as a sharecropper and he lived in row houses. And I know this for a fact, but he actually owned the land. And we believe that a white family actually rented that land from him. And that was done in a way to keep his ownership of the land secret so that it wasn't taken away from him. T.H. Roan is on my grandfather and my mother's side. And he was an entrepreneur in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. He owned a grocery store. This happens to be an article about a break-in at his store. But I mention it just because there have always been Black entrepreneurs. But lack of capital and access has in many cases made it very difficult for these businesses to thrive. But more importantly, the legal protection has made it difficult to transfer these businesses. So when he died, essentially his business died with him. Now, each of these three are actually exceptions to the rule in terms of even having access to these as tools, because most Black Americans at this time had none of these access. But in all three cases, they were actually not able to transfer the wealth that they had, even at that time, down to the rest of my family. And that's also a pattern that you'll see. Next slide. So this all begs the question of why. Next slide. And my answer in one word is fear. Next slide. There are four responses to fear, and this response that I have here is not germane to, white America or race. This is just responses to fear in general. There's a fight, a face, a flight, or a freeze. And as I see it, systematic racism by government and individuals historically has just tried to repel the issue of race altogether. The justice courts and systems, police and courts, were designed to engage race, but to engage race in a way that would essentially attack it and protect and preserve and mitigate the current structure. Most Americans individually have done everything in their power to disengage from issues of race, either by denying it, admitting it, trying to hide from the fact that it exists, or rationalizing it in one form or another. I do believe that we're moving into an environment where there is a positive engagement right now in race, where people are looking to attack the systems of racial inequities. They're looking to try to not defend, but rather break those ties and better understand them. And so from that perspective, I have some encouragement. Next slide. There's been an unconscious and a conscious fear that's guided almost every step of America along the way, from the Second Amendment to Colin Kaepernick, right? So fear of Black people has guided the formation and practices of our justice system, of our residential housing and development, of our education. It's encouraged Americans to avoid to engage, white Americans in particular, in difficult racial conversations. It has influenced and in many cases had Americans attack the very idea that racism even exists, which is what it was like when I was growing up. But it's also encouraged a lot of media and legislative officials to really leverage fear as a way of grasping power. But again, I do think that we are moving into a very interesting, and a time that I'm not sure I ever thought I would see, of a willingness of Americans to engage in this issue.
Yeah.
And I think I just have one more slide, maybe two more. So what I want to leave you with, though, is there's an untapped productivity that's been stifled by racism. And given where we are right now in the country, next slide, I think it's really important that we get here. This is just, as I said, oversimplification of race. You know, we started with no rights in the 18th century. The right to be a citizen was the 19th century fight. The right to be heard was what we spent most of the 20th century trying to do. And we're now at a point where we're now at the right to be believed. And I think that's important. Next slide and the last slide here, which is when you think about structural racism, housing, employment, education, imprisonment, and voting, this untapped potential, Kellogg estimates there's almost $2 trillion of jobs and value to the economy if we can somehow break this impasse. The cost of structural racism to America is immense, but the direct cost of racism to Black people is immeasurable.
Yeah. Wow, Bo. Let's everybody please give Bo a round of applause for that very important and, you know, upsetting but powerful presentation. Wow.
Well, I know there were some questions possibly. I'm willing to, I know we only have a few minutes before we get to the hour.
Are you able to stay a few minutes longer?
I can, yeah.
Stay, Bo?
I'm able to stay a little longer.
Great. So put the questions in the chat that people have. And, you know, I'll just say, while those are coming in, Bo, that, you know, as you know, we've talked about this in the 80s. I marched with Reverend Al Sharpton in Crown Heights, Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, when Yusuf Hawkins was killed.
Right.
And, you know, you talk about that fear, right? There are 300 of us marching, not millions, but 300 of us. And there were more people on the sidewalk, white people throwing bottles and rocks at us than there were total people in the march. And the media was either attacking, hostile, or completely silent. The only media that covered us, you'll not be surprised to hear, was the Black press, the Amsterdam News,
right.
the Chicago Defender, which most white people don't even know exists, by the way, right? Okay, so let's see what kinds of questions we have here. Okay, wow, there's a lot of questions. Let's see. So Dev actually wrote that he's reading a book about the combination of slavery and the, you know, expropriation of lands from the Native Americans, which is the dual, right, combo.
Yeah.
But let me. But he said he had a question here in terms of rate of change. What do you think? How does this historical context, he asked, inform you on what the rate of change could be over the next few years? And like you said, both you and I never thought this would happen, right? Most people who thought about this.
Well, then again, I never thought there'd be a Black president in my lifetime too. So look at that. You know, I think what's amazing to me is that when I look at what's happening today, that it is the participation level of white America is just unbelievable. I was in Arizona taking care of my mother in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is decidedly not of color.
Right.
And
very white community.
Instances in 110-degree heat, there were 2 teenage white girls who were standing on the corner by themselves, no media, with signs saying Black Lives Matter, right? They were out in the heat, just protesting, just 2 of them by themselves, not a whole team of people, because they needed to basically make that statement in Scottsdale, Arizona. And that is a sea change from where we were 4 months ago, let alone 10 years ago. I think that, you know, I didn't write my presentation with the intent to try to make an argument for reparations, right? But I think it's impossible to know the history of what's here and to see the level of documentation that actually exists without coming to the conclusion that some form of reparations are absolutely necessary as a redress to what's happened, because it's all centered around the redistribution of wealth. And the mythology of this bootstrap is really designed to rationalize why it's been okay for us not to talk about the generational wealth that's been created by those early settlers, and why we can rationalize what a lot of people of color, Native Americans, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans don't have today. But my interest in doing this was really just to tell a story using common, normal people, where you can see as much documented evidence as possible, so that this is not a political statement. It's just, this is my family. This is these people I'm connected to. And I search every day to validate and sometimes to invalidate relationships that I believe exist in my family, because I think the story of us is actually so complicated that to try to dissolve it down to something simplistic is problematic in and of itself.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that, you know, and I think you talk about this is, because a lot of white people are, what do I do? What do I do? Right? Like, and it's long term, but certainly educate yourself. Like, you know, understand this history, because white people do not know the history of this country.
Well,
They
I
were
think
not,
that to me
we
is
were
the
not
biggest
taught the
issue.
history of this country. We
I
were,
think there's been a decided effort to, um, you know, listen, we all have family. Our families are not perfect. You know, just because your uncle may drink too much doesn't mean he's a horrible person in every other aspect, right? But there's been this ethos in America that to somehow talk about the ugly part of our country is to somehow invalidate everything about our country. And I think the ignorance that we have perpetuated of understanding how we came to be what we are actually put us in a position where you got 2 million people right now that are suffering at least from COVID, and, you know, 120,000 people that are dead. I mean, I believe it's that direct in the line. And so I just think that's always better for us to have a much better understanding of the historical context for all of these things, to have a more complete conversation.
Bo, there's a range of questions from what's a step I could take to address institutional racism to, you know, what institutions or organizations might you recommend getting involved with, contributing money to, supporting? And you know, I'm happy to collate that. We can talk about it and send it out to everyone, but I wonder if you had some initial.
I think the single most important question that white people have to ask themselves repeatedly is, when I am fearful of someone Black, why? Right? There are reasons to be fearful, right? And so, you know, what Will Smith says, you know, danger is real, fear is in your mind, from that one movie that didn't do so well, but it's a great quote. There are reasons at times to be fearful. And I think what you'll see is, in most instances where the police are shooting Black folks, the core legal question was it reasonable for that police officer to fear for his or her life? And if the answer is yes, then anything that they do to that person is then justified. And all they have to prove is to a jury of their peers that it is reasonable to be fearful for my life if a Black person raises their arms, a Black person, a Black man stands up. It could be a million different things, right? A Black woman raises her voice. All of those are reasonable interpretations of actions that could make someone fearful, and therefore the action I take in response is legally justified. And at its core, it's that, you know, Amy Cooper, for whatever her reasons, she went from angry to fearful. And the moment she became fearful, she panicked. And her panic pushed her right into a place where she did something that maybe she wouldn't have done otherwise. And I think that most—
I bet if we asked Amy Cooper 3 months ago, she said, you're going to be the poster child of white privilege and racism. Do you think that would happen? No, I voted for Obama. I'm, you know,
right.
blah, 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 blah. But it's, you know, this is deep.
It is deep. And most people, it's not conscious. And for most people, it doesn't even happen all the time, right? So one situation, you know, a person coming onto an elevator with me, right, who may not know me but has seen me, would have a completely different response than a person who's never seen me before coming onto that same elevator, right? And so, you know, it's not that every instance where someone is fearful is unjustified. It's that what white folks have to actually evaluate in themselves at any given moment is why I have that fear, and to really question whether that fear is justified. Because I think just the process of doing that alone will A, start to actually help them recognize their unconscious bias, and B, will help them in places counteract their unconscious bias. Yeah. Sometimes it's just going to show you, hey, I got a bias, right? You know, my dad never got over the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. You know, I mean, there are things that we have as biases that we may not be able to get over, but I think it's important to evaluate that. And that's an individual action. It is not something that's going to be done in groups. It's something that you have to engage yourself and see it as important.
Yeah. And, you know, it was you know, I as I mentioned at the beginning, I thought I was such an activist, and I, you know, knew all this stuff, and I came and I worked in the 80s, and, you know, my eyes were ripped out of my head and put back in again. I mean, one of the things I think about is a willingness, like, to hear some hard things, you know, and my Black colleagues, bosses, and organizer friends were not saying I was a bad person, but they were saying I was blind and unaware of the privilege and unaware of the impact I was having when I did certain things. And man, that was tough. As it was tough then, it's tough today, you know. But you know, come on, can't we handle tough things?
Well,
I mean,
listen,
that's
we
whole
have the same problem as men, right? And dealing
Excuse
with
me?
women.
Yeah,
And so it's,
yeah,
you know, it's not germane to just one group. It's part of, you know, who we are built as human beings. But I think the act of even attempting is a start. It's not sufficient, but it's a start. I think the act of actually better educating ourselves about that history, it matters. I think, you know, it's not about guilt, but it is about taking responsibility for our own actions and thoughts. And that means having to ask the questions and kind of challenge ourselves in each of those instances. And I think once you recognize how much fear plays a role in the construction of all of our systems and how we respond to things, it becomes easy to assess whether that fear is real or whether it's made up. It also becomes easier to spot when that fear is being used as a way to get us to consciously or unconsciously do things that in fact may not be rectifying the danger that it's supposed to.
yeah. Well, there's a lot of, first of all, a lot of incredible thank yous in the chat here, and we'll collect this and give it to you.
That'd be great.
See all of it. People are just very moved and touched by the, you know, the depth of the presentation and the nuance. There's a lot of conversation about reparations. I would just add, you and I both went to business school. Many of the people on the call did. I say, you know, what we have here is a case of denied shareholder rights. These are equity owners. I mean, this country was literally built on Native American land and African American labor. Enormous wealth, as you pointed out, was created and transferred across generations, but was not for the case of many African Americans. And so for me, reparations has always been simple. You know, it's you know, if you believe in capitalism and you think of shareholder rights, then you know, what's the controversy?
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I saw a question here from my business school roommate, Dirk, which was Dirk Hall, who asked, you know, what is it that, you know, as many of us, not all of us, business school grads, we should be thinking about. I would just tell you, this issue of access to capital is a reflection of what we've just talked about. Yeah. And what's crazy is, truthfully, I've been fairly successful, but my access to capital is still not equal to my peers from Harvard Business School. And I was in private equity before I went to business school, right? And had been venture funded before I went to business school. And my ability to get capital is still not as strong as people that didn't have that background that I went to school with. Yeah. And that speaks to our unconscious bias, but it also speaks to the networks that are formed. Because, you know, we do business with our friends. I mean, that's just human nature. We do business with people that we find commonality in one form or another. And so I think the most important challenge to each of us, particularly those who are managing organizations, whether they be big or small, is to really push the boundaries of your networks and your relationships. You know, force yourself in many instances to develop relationships with people that may not have a lot of commonality with you at first glance, because that process in and of itself actually democratizes to a large extent opportunity. And that's what we're not often forced to do, because it's a personal choice of who we want to associate ourselves with. Right. But if you think it's important for you to actually be in a position to kind of break the bonds that we see of this structural racism, forcing yourself to develop those networks outside of your comfort zone, right? Go on and become friends with someone who loves cricket, even though you only play baseball. I'm just using crazy analogies, but whatever it may be, right, is the way to actually build that bridge and that bond in a very practical way that many of us can actually do.
You know, Bo, to that point, Deborah Fries, one of our classmates, right, writes that she's got a cohort of fund managers of color deploying capital to entrepreneurs of color in 12 communities across the country. It's called bostonimpact.org.
Yeah, that's
So
great.
fantastic, Deborah. Love that. Um,
That is awesome.
there's so much to say. Like you and I have talked a lot about this. Like, growing up, it was easy for me to believe that it was my hard work, because I went through some really, well, through some really tough stuff that no kid
Yeah.
should have to go through. You and I talked about that. And I thought, well, I believed a version of the bootstrap thing. But then I got to New York and was a community organizer, and that like got totally reorganized. Like, holy moly, what I came to understand was, yes, I went through some really hard stuff, but when I put some extra effort in, a huge marching band popped up behind me. Like, the teachers came out of the woodwork, all these other, I was flooded with resources. And there was actually, there were two young African-American boys who started with me in 6th grade, and they were from Compton Watts. And by 8th grade, there was no marching band behind them. And things were radically different. Just over a 2-year period, things that they were from a neighborhood where the Bloods were just beginning to develop. We came up at the time that started to happen, and their lives were, it was just, the teachers were not coming out for them. The institutional support was not there.
Yeah.
Right. And I really, I learned to see that in a new way after I became a community organizer and discovered, there's so many small things. Like, white children typically are given the message, you're worthwhile. You can, we're behind you. You're worth something. You matter. Whereas kids in the poorest neighborhoods and, Bedside, Brooklyn, and when I was working, that is not the message they get from the school system, from the institutions, from the country as a whole. It's like baked in deep.
Well, it's a complicated issue, right? Because there are many aspects that require both sides to engage, differently, and no one of us is going to solve this issue by ourselves. I think that the networking and pushing your boundaries is an important aspect. I think educating yourself is an important aspect. I think, operating not from a place of guilt, but from a place of interest, right? So you don't have to be guilty for everything. There's a lot of people that don't feel that they've had any direct benefit that have had tons of direct benefit. I've had direct benefit from many of the things that have happened over time. That doesn't mean that my life isn't hard. And I think there's a lot of people that are so focused on the basis of comparison and trying to, that it becomes difficult to have a real conversation. I think what's important is to recognize that if you go a long period of time of not acknowledging kind of the crimes and the sins of the past, not only are you going to repeat them, but you're going to fester a cancer that will ultimately kill you. And I think what we see at various points in history, are, every 50 to 75 years, that cancer kind of, or that blister, rips open, and it comes in these forms of uprisings that take place, of frustration. And it isn't coming out of nowhere, although it may often seem like it's coming out of nowhere. It's coming from, a million little straws that have finally learned and focused on one that broke the camel's back, right?
Yeah.
And so I think you can't rectify that all at one time, right? And these things come in ebb and flows. What I would say to all of those who are part of the struggle is, we probably got about 18 months to make change before everybody forgets about where we are right now.
To forget, or both.
And so, whatever change you think is possible, you better get on it right now. Yeah, Lisa says, vote, vote, vote. You better vote 5 times with your fake mail-in ballots while you're at it. But yeah, that's a joke, FBI. That's a joke. Yeah, that's a joke. But yeah, it's only, you got short periods and windows to make this change. It's important. I will say this, the fact that I had this same argument with one of our business school classmates, in fact, one of my section mates, about who was complaining about Colin Kaepernick kneeling. And I made the point to him that why is it okay for there to be Confederate flags at football games and that not be an affront to our military, yet it's a total affront to the military to kneel at the national anthem. Now, mind you, most Black Americans have had family who fought in these wars, going back to, in some cases, the Revolutionary War, and never got land, never got compensated, and couldn't even vote. My grandfather was a captain in the army and couldn't vote after he fought in World War II and didn't get the GI Bill, right? You want to talk about patriotism, right?
Yeah.
So to think that when someone like Colin Kaepernick kneels, that somehow is an affront to the military, I just don't understand. But I will say, positing the flag of a treasonous group whose intent was to overthrow the United States government, well, that is undoubtedly, right, an act of dishonor to the United States. So for me, I just couldn't understand how it could be okay at football games to have the Confederate flag. And the fact that we're even having this conversation now, that's progress. I mean, there's no other way to look at it.
I mean, Bo, you and I know the truth of this. If we did this talk a year ago, we would have had 15 people here rather than 300.
Yeah, no, I'm in shock that people are engaged, and I feel
thrilled.
blessed.
Yeah.
And this is a work in product. I mean, what I really wanted to produce was, so my vision was to try to create a series of kind of YouTube videos that kind of tell the story of America just using my family and the documentation that I've been able to identify. And that way I could make it personal. So it's not that I have to make some political statement about everybody else, but there are patterns that exist from what I'm finding.
Why don't we help you do that, Bo? Brittany and I were thinking the thought at the same time. We'd love to help you create those videos.
That'd be awesome. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, that'd be so important. Wow, there's so many more comments in here. Dirk, your roommate again, had one more question for you. You might want to answer. How has learning about your family history in the context of the American story affected you personally? It's a great question.
There's so many stories that all of us have about our backgrounds that are kind of urban legend, right? You ask a lot of Americans, you ask a lot of white Americans, and they'll say things like, well, I'm an eighth this and I'm a quarter this. They don't really know, right, what they are, but that's what they think their family is. I think getting the DNA test, I'm 17% Irish. I'm more Irish than many white folks who consider themselves Irish. Seeing
Actually,
the
you
stories,
and I are the same Irish amount.
Yeah, right. I think I had these stories in my family about all the Native Americans in my family. I have yet to find those people. Maybe they exist, but I've not got documentation of that. My wife's side, definitively, their family actually traveled back and forth from the Oma tribe reservations to New Orleans. But in my family, where I've been told this, I've not been able to find it. But I also think what I did in order to find my family is it forced me to learn the history of the slave owners of my family. And I think a lot of people are very afraid to do that. But it was also fascinating for me to learn and understand kind of why they moved or immigrated to the United States and how they moved from one place to the next. The stories there are fascinating. Some same families fought on the Union side, others on the Confederate side. So, I mean, I think what it did for me is it showed me that people can go from looking like you, Phil, to me in less than 2 generations. Yeah. It showed me that the complexity of the relationships is deeper than that, right? Most of the instances where a white slave owner had sex with someone black was non-consensual, but there were undoubtedly, in rare instances, some consensual relationships. And you can see that in New Orleans more than you see it in other places. It also just shows me how directly tied to specific activities that took place. The French-Indian War, the War of 1812, all these things that we are supposed to learn in history, it made it easier for me to understand what the implications of them were as I attached them directly to my family. Yeah. And I just feel like that's a better way of teaching American history to students than it is making it abstract, like forcing children to spend a little bit of time trying to figure out what some of their familiar relationships are beyond them gives them a sense that they are part of a bigger cause than even their mother and father, regardless of what their familiar situation is. And I just think that's a better way of doing history.
Those court documents from 1848.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's my sister. She found that.
That is a miscegenation case. Somebody asked earlier what miscegenation means. It's mixing of the races, which, race is a false construct, obviously, in the cultural sense. But it's, those laws that the
Yeah.
the Americans, we Americans passed back during the days of slavery and then Jim Crow. Yeah, and that the
Yeah.
Nazis copied us on.
I
Yeah.
will admit a period interest is being able to identify all of these folks who very much do not see themselves as related to me
Yeah.
online, and being able to prove to them without doubt, oh, no, we're cousins.
By the way, Bo, Lisa Leshney said that you and I look like brothers, and actually, I think we sort of do.
We do.
We do. We look like brothers, and I'm very proud. I'm proud to be your brother, Bo. Lisa also said she's 1% Irish and 99% East European Jew, and wonders if she can celebrate St. Patty's Day. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Lisa, come celebrate with Bo and I. We'll have a great St. Patty's Day.
Drinking is universal.
Roger Grunwald, who I mentioned earlier. Oh, well, first of all, Christy Chin, who's on the phone, is on the board of vote.org, which is very
Oh, wow. Important.
And everyone to figure out if they're registered to vote and get a mail-in ballot if they need that.
Yes.
Roger wrote, he's the son of an Auschwitz survivor I'd mentioned, right? And he's taught me so much. And not only did the Nazis copy all of the laws from the Jim Crow South, the miscegenation laws, and that, chart you showed about the drop of blood and all that. But they also copied a manifest destiny, which we're taught in schools, this wonderful thing that we had, which of course meant the destruction of Native Americans, communities, the killing of Native Americans, and the expansion of slavery. And in fact, Hitler's entire policy of moving east, of invading Poland and Soviet Union, was all about he literally said, this is our manifest destiny. This is,
right.
We're being inspired by what the Americans did. When they moved west, we're moving east, but it's the same thing. We need living room for our German white race. And, this is, it's hard to hear these lessons and to learn this history because, it's not what we learned growing up. But as you said, it's not the only thing that's true about America, because we also have this promise.
Absolutely.
And the angels of our better selves. And I think this is a moment where maybe we can bridge that gap between the promise and the reality.
Well, there was a comment that came up that was talking about there being a descendant of Confederate generals and others. What I would just say is, listen, in almost every case, all of us had folks that were on both sides of these wars.
Yeah.
And so I think the issue is not so much, you need to feel shame or the privilege as it is to recognize and acknowledge, right, the complexity of, this country, how it's impacted you, how it impacts us, how we built our systems. Because once you can at least acknowledge the role that these things have played in the development of the systems that we're in, it becomes easier to understand why they may need to be changed or rectified. It becomes easier to mold yourself into the change that often is very difficult for any one of us to do kind of on our own. And so I don't think it's something to shy away from. I don't have a problem with people that want to, promote their, great-great-grandfather who was a Confederate such and such. I think it's just a recognition that they were on the wrong side of history, right? And what they believed in at that time, for whatever the reasons were wrong. One of the things that I saw for a lot of the white slave owners that owned my ancestors is that the Civil War had a demonstrable impact on them financially. So just as, it's not the equivalence, and I don't want to make it equivalent, but the transatlantic slave trade was a redistribution of wealth of people. Well, what happened after the Civil War was a redistribution of wealth within America between white folks, right? It wasn't that all of a sudden black people got money. That didn't happen. But there was a redistribution of wealth north and away from the South. And you can see it in families. And, when you look at the census tracts, it not only will tell you the education levels of people, it will also tell you if they own a home or rent a home, what the approximate value of that home is. So it gives you some beacons to try to get a sense of what's happening financially to these families. And you can see a significant drop-off in wealth in many of these families. Now, there are other instances where, frankly, the Civil War basically had no impact on the generational wealth that had been created by some of these plantations. But in others, it was significant. So it varies. from population to population.
And
I would
let's
just say you should look, you should read it for what it is, as
right.
opposed to using it as some cudgel.
And the development of the industrial North before, during, and after the Civil War was predicated on the slave economy. You know, cotton going north into the textile mills, and you know the selling of cotton exports to England, which was a major source of currency for the whole United States at the time. So, you know, I think people are beginning to understand that this is not a Southern white question. The entire country was built on this.
Well, I would just say when Benjamin Franklin went to France in order to convince France to support their effort in the Revolutionary War, the debt that France took from the United States was predicated on the ability of us to produce the agricultural product that would essentially pay back that debt, which was on the backs of slavery, period, right? So it's impossible to extract race from the very formation, of everything related to this country.
DNA.
You know, first person killed in the Revolutionary War was black. You know, we wouldn't have been able to actually fight the British colonies without the support of France, because there was no financial mechanism to do so, and that was on the basis of slavery. So there's almost nothing that you can point to that isn't directly and tangibly connected, because it's all connected to the economic system of our country, right? And so there is no system anywhere in the world that's not tied to the economic system. And that's why race is so integral, right? Yeah. It's not that, and that's why I think people sometimes make the disconnect. They get offended when you say race was integral to everything that happens, because they think somehow it's just about race. No, it's because our economic system is built on race, right? Our laws are built on race. And if you want proof, just look at what I was talking about in miscegenation. You wouldn't even go through the process of worrying about that unless it was really important to you in the first place, right? I mean, why did the state of Tennessee need to actually file a lawsuit against, my great-grandfather and his wife? Like, why? They were living in the middle of nothing in Green, Tennessee. It's not a lot of people then. It's not a lot of people now, right? Yeah. Like, why? What were they doing?
Right. And Bo, one of the things that I think maybe this moment we're in will challenge for the first time in American history is that if you go back to like the Revolutionary War, one of the things that happened is that Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, one of the challenges that they had, these were the wealthy, tiny wealthy elite of the colonies, right? How do they get the white, poor farmers to join the revolution against the British? And they used two tactics. They said, number one, we will maintain slavery. And this was a plus for poor white farmers who wanted to be able to potentially benefit from slavery, even if they weren't yet. And we will take those Native American lands and give them to you. Whereas the British were going to free the slaves and protect the Native Americans. Right. And that, so as an American, how do you think about that? Because, you have the Declaration of Independence, which is one of history's most wonderful documents, right? So it's not saying that there isn't this promise of America, this promise of freedom and equality. It's that if you look at what actually happened to recruit people into the Revolutionary War, it was baked in from the beginning. You're better than, and we will, than Africans that we've brought here, and we will maintain slavery. So there's a promise that you too can become wealthy on their backs, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that, how do you keep those? I'll just add one other thing. 2,500 years ago, the very first book ever written was by Herodotus, ancient Greek, right? And he talks about the Athenians finally being freed from tyranny, and that it was at that moment of their freedom that they achieved their greatness. And that when they were in tyranny and enslaved, they could not, create. And then 250 years ago, we have the Declaration of Independence and this great call for freedom and equality. Now, 250 years later, and 2,500 years after Herodotus wrote about the Athenians, who, by the way, women weren't even allowed to leave their home. They had no voting rights. They had no rights at all. And they had slaves in their society, right? And then we had slavery 250 years ago, and we still have the effects of it today in very powerful ways. Maybe we're at this moment in history where we can say, we're going to finally embrace something that we have talked about for 2,500 years, for 125 generations. Is that possible? I didn't think, if you asked me a year ago, I would have said no. But
crazier things have happened.
Yeah.
Listen, I just see someone that mentioned something about the Taino people, and I didn't get to talk about it, but I will just mention maybe as a last point before we close out. I've actually traced my wife's mother is Puerto Rican, her father is African American Creole from New Orleans, and I've traced her Puerto Rican family all the way back to Spain, which is difficult because the census only started in the 1900s in Puerto Rico. And all of her family is from Ceiba, the county there. It's in the east of the island. And once you go beyond the 1900s, you have to go back to Spanish records. So my Spanish is like childlike, you know. I'm basically at the Dora Explorer level. I can understand curse words, but my ability to speak, but I can read census information in Spanish. So I'm still working.
Hey, Bo, I bet if there were any Spanish documents you needed help with, I bet there's somebody on this phone call who'd be happy to jump in and translate, right?
Yeah.
And Chris Capers has written a lovely note. Chris, so glad you're here with us too. He writes, he's glad people of all races are engaging in these important and sometimes uncomfortable conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you. Good to hear from you, Chris.
So, Bo, one of the things that has been said a couple of times is, like, as you continue to do your research, we should do another one of these sessions.
I'd love to. There's other parts of the research. I mean, I only had an hour, which we've taken a little bit more. I tried to contain this, but there are other parts of the research that are just totally different. There's just amazing things that my sister, I have to give a lot of credit for, because she's done just unbelievable research. But between us, you know, we've tried to get as many cotton swabs from family members as possible. So we could circle the wagons and DNA and answer a lot of questions that were hard. And the one thing that, for those of you who are interested, I thought about maybe giving some tips about how I've traced my family, because, you know, when I was showing you the colonial roads and things, you know, I had to go back and kind of look at travel patterns and understand some history, because that was the only way for me to try to connect the dots. And I still have a lot of gaps in my family that I'm working through.
Well, so let's say we're definitely going to do this again, and we're going to help you with videos on YouTube, and maybe, you know, this will be one way we produce those videos, is to have a live audience or something, whatever, you know, makes sense, Bo, for you.
Absolutely. We'll figure it out.
This has just been amazing, and it's brought so much to everybody who is here and who will be watching this later on YouTube. And, you know, I mean, I'm so, you know, I've had the private pleasure of being educated by you, and I'm so excited that so many more people can have access to, you know, your bravery, your courage, your insights, your smarts, and what you're doing, I think, to help lead a new kind of conversation in this world, Bo.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.